The moment Julia Ramsey stepped off the westbound train at Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, the wind hit her like a fist, stealing the hat clean off her head and sending it tumbling across the platform into the red dust beyond. And she thought, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had made up her mind before she ever boarded at St. Louis, that she had made a terrible mistake. She was 24 years old, a schoolteacher by training, and she had come west not out of romance or adventure but out of pure, grinding necessity. Her father, Harold Ramsey, had died the previous November, leaving behind nothing but debts that ate through the small inheritance Julia had expected to carry her through her next few years of quiet city living. Her older brother, Thomas, had written to her from Caldwell with an offer that was really more of a plea. Come west, help him run the general store he had built, and live in the spare room above it until she could figure out what came next. Julia had agreed because she had no other reasonable option, and she had spent the entire train journey reminding herself that this was temporary. She was not the kind of woman who belonged in a frontier town. She had grown up in St. Louis, attended a proper school, read Dickens and Eliot, and spent her evenings at recitals and lectures. She intended to return to that life as soon as Thomas no longer needed her, or as soon as she had saved enough money to get back on her feet. She retrieved her hat from the edge of the platform, reshaped it as best she could, and stood for a moment looking at the town of Caldwell spread out before her. It was not entirely without shape. There was a main street with a row of wooden-fronted buildings, a hotel, a livery, a saloon that was already loud at 4 in the afternoon, a church with a fresh coat of white paint, and at the far end, a blacksmith whose hammering rang out above everything else. Cattle pens lined the southern edge of town, and the smell of the stockyards reached her even at this distance, warm and thick and nothing like St. Louis. Thomas was waiting for her at the bottom of the platform steps, broader through the shoulders than she remembered, with a sunburned face and a wide, relieved smile. He grabbed her trunk before she could protest and led her toward the store at a pace that suggested he had learned to move quickly out here. "You look tired," he said, which was his way of saying she looked fragile. "I am tired," she said. "It was 3 days on a train." "You'll like it here," he said, with the optimism of a man who had chosen this life and therefore needed to believe it was a good one. Julia said nothing. She intended to survive it, which was a different thing entirely. The general store was called Ramsey's, which she thought showed a lack of imagination, but also a comforting practicality. It was a solid building, better stocked than she had expected, with barrels of flour and sugar near the door, shelves of canned goods and dry fabric, a glass case with tobacco and patent medicines, and a counter scarred with use but clean. The room above was small and low-ceilinged, with a brass-framed bed, a washstand, a writing desk, and a window that looked out over the main street. It was not entirely without charm, she decided, as long as she did not compare it to anything she had known before. She set up her books on the desk, unpacked her dresses into the small wardrobe, placed her father's photograph on the windowsill, and told herself this was fine. This was manageable. She would be here 6 months, perhaps a year, and then she would go back. She began working in the store the very next morning because Thomas needed her and because standing still felt worse than moving. She learned quickly. She was good with numbers and had a natural precision that customers seemed to appreciate. She did not pretend to enjoy the dust that crept in under the door, or the way the wind howled at night, or the casual violence of the cattle drives that passed through town every few weeks, filling the streets with noise and confusion and men who smelled powerfully of horses and leather, and weeks on the open range. It was during one of those drives, 3 weeks after her arrival, that she first encountered Graham Winslow. She was behind the counter checking an inventory list when the door opened, and a man ducked inside, pulling off his hat as he entered. He was tall, somewhere around 28 or 29, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 2 days of stubble. His eyes were a shade of gray-green that she noticed immediately, partly because they caught the light from the window in an unusual way, and partly because they were looking at her with an expression of frank, uncalculated interest that was different from the way most men in Caldwell looked at her, which was either with the special caution they reserved for unfamiliar women or with the special boldness they deployed after 2 hours at the saloon. He was not bold and he was not cautious. He was simply looking at her the way a person looks at something they find genuinely interesting. "Good afternoon," he said. "I need to settle an account for the Winslow outfit. My father usually handles it, but he's occupied with the herd today." He set his hat on the counter with the ease of a man who felt comfortable in most spaces. "I'm Graham Winslow." "Julia Ramsey," she said, because she believed in introducing herself plainly. "Thomas Ramsey is my brother. I'll look up the account." She found it in the ledger. The Winslow outfit ran cattle north from Texas to the Kansas railheads every year, and they bought supplies from Ramsey's regularly enough that Thomas had extended them credit. The balance was reasonable. She told Graham the amount. He counted it out from a worn leather pouch, and she wrote the receipt in the ledger with her careful schoolteacher handwriting. "You're new," he said, watching her write. "I've been here 3 weeks." "From where?" "St. Louis." Something in his expression shifted just slightly, the way a man's face shifts when he makes a small internal calculation. "Long way from home." "Yes," she said, and handed him the receipt. He folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and picked up his hat. Then he did something she did not expect. Instead of leaving, he leaned one arm on the counter and said, with the easy curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to know, "What do you think of it so far?" She looked at him for a moment. She was not accustomed to being asked that question, because most people who lived out here did not want to know what newcomers thought, and most newcomers were too polite or too uncertain to answer honestly. She was neither. "I think it is very loud, very dusty, very far from anything I consider civilized, and the wind is relentless," she said. He did not look offended. He looked, if anything, slightly amused, but not in the condescending way. "Fair," he said. "It's all of those things." "Then we're in agreement," she said. "We are," he said. "Good day, Miss Ramsey." He left, and she watched through the window as he swung up onto a dark bay horse with the particular ease of someone who had been doing that since before he could properly read. She returned to her inventory list and told herself she had not thought about his eyes for more than 30 seconds afterward. She was lying, but it was a small lie, and she let it stand. Over the following 2 weeks, the Winslow cattle drive completed its business at the Caldwell stockyards, and Graham Winslow came into the store 3 more times, once for tobacco and a sack of cornmeal, once for a length of rope that Thomas cut from the spool, once for no reason that Julia could identify, because he bought only a small paper bag of peppermints, and then stood at the counter talking to her for 20 minutes about the water situation along the Kishom Trail and whether she had read anything lately worth recommending. She had, as it happened. She was reading George Eliot's Middlemarch, which she had brought from St. Louis, and she told him so, not expecting him to have an opinion on the subject. He had one. He had not read Middlemarch, but he had read Adam Bede, which his mother had owned, and he thought George Eliot understood something true about the way ordinary people trap themselves with their own choices. He said this plainly, and without any apparent need for her to be impressed by it, which impressed her more than if he had been showing off. She found herself talking to him with a naturalness she did not entirely expect. He asked questions without prying, listened without interrupting, and had the quality, rare in anyone she had met, of paying complete attention to whoever he was speaking to. When a customer came in, he stepped back without being asked, waited until she had finished, and then resumed the conversation exactly where it had been interrupted. When the drive finally moved on north and the Winslow outfit left Caldwell, the main street felt slightly less interesting for several days, which Julia told herself was simply the result of having gotten used to a certain level of activity. She threw herself into the work of the store with more energy than before, partly because Thomas needed her, and partly because she had discovered that busyness was an effective remedy for the specific kind of restlessness she felt in the evenings. When the town grew quiet, and the sky over the prairie turned colors she had never seen above St. Louis, deep amber and violet, and a particular shade of rose that seemed to exist only out here, where there was nothing between the earth and the sky to dilute it. She began to teach as well. There was a schoolhouse at the edge of town that had been without a proper teacher for most of the past year, and when the town mayor, a blunt and sensible man named Horace Aldridge, heard that a trained schoolteacher had arrived in Caldwell, he appeared at Ramsey's store within 2 days and offered her a modest salary to take over the afternoon classes. The morning hours she kept at the store, and the afternoons she spent with 17 children between the ages of 6 and 14 in a room that smelled of chalk and pine resin and the particular collective energy of young people who would rather be outside. She liked it more than she expected. The children were not so different from those she had taught in St. Louis, only more likely to arrive with mud on their boots and more likely to have actual working knowledge of things she had only read about: the geography of the plains, the habits of animals, the names of plants that grew along creek beds. She learned from them as much as she taught them, which was a kind of exchange she found genuinely satisfying. She wrote to her friend Margaret in St. Louis, "I am still counting the days, but the days are more interesting than I expected. Do not read too much into that." The Winslow outfit came south again in late August, coming back through Caldwell from the northern ranges to resupply before the long drive back to Texas. This was, Graham explained when he came into the store the morning after they arrived, the way it worked most years: north in spring with the cattle, south in fall with lighter loads and more money. He had been gone for roughly 4 months, and Julia noticed several things when he walked in. She noticed that he was leaner than before, which the trail did to most men. She noticed that his hat was newer. She noticed that he came in alone, without any of the other hands, which was unusual because most of the cowboys traveled in pairs or groups when they came into town. She noticed these things the way she noticed things she was trying not to be too interested in, which was to say, she noticed them completely and in considerable detail. He noticed things about her, too, as it turned out. He noticed that she had rearranged the shelves behind the counter to make the canned goods more accessible. He noticed that she was wearing a different style of dress from before, simpler and more practical. He noticed that her hands, which had been quite soft in April, now showed the small calluses of someone who worked with them. "You've settled in," he said, after they had handled his account and he had lingered in the way she had come to expect, as though leaving was something he was in no particular hurry to do. "I'm surviving it," she said carefully. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He bought the peppermints again, which she had begun to think of as his particular affectation, and then he said, in the straightforward way he had, "Would you be willing to walk with me this evening? There's something I'd like to show you. Nothing improper. I want you to see the land at sunset from the North Ridge. It's different from anything in town." She looked at him. He was not flirtatious in the conventional sense, and there was nothing in his manner that suggested he was maneuvering for something she did not want to give. He simply wanted to show her something, the way a person wants to share a thing they find genuinely beautiful. "All right," she said, which surprised them both slightly. They walked out to the North Ridge that evening, Thomas watching from the store window with an expression of careful neutrality that Julia could read perfectly well. The ridge was not high, only a gentle rise above the flat surrounding land, but from its crest the view opened in all directions in a way that stopped her breath for a moment. The grass ran away in every direction like a slow green sea, and the sky above it was in the process of executing one of those performances she had started to notice in her evenings alone, the colors shifting through amber and gold into deep red, and above that a particular shade of blue that deepened by the second as the stars began to come through. She stood very still for a moment. "It does that every night?" she asked. "Every clear night," he said. "Changes every time, though." You never get the same one twice." She did not say anything for a while because she was looking at it, and she thought that if she had seen this before making any judgments about this place, her judgments might have been slightly different. Not entirely different. The dust was still real, and the wind was still relentless, and the stockyard still smelled, and none of that was changed by a beautiful sky. But it added something to the account that she had not previously included. "It's beautiful," she said at last, because it was, and she was not in the habit of withholding true statements. "Yes," he said. He was not looking at the sky. He was looking at her, and she was aware of it, and she chose to continue looking at the sky. They walked back to the store as the first full dark came on, and he left her at the door with the same directness with which he did everything. A simple good evening and a tip of his hat. No lingering or reaching for something that had not been offered. She went upstairs and sat at her desk and looked at the photograph of her father for a long time. She thought about what it meant that she had enjoyed that. She thought about the practicalities. He was a cowboy, which meant he was on the trail more than half the year, which meant a life of absence and uncertainty, and the particular grinding anxiety of waiting for a man who might not come back from the next drive. She thought about the kind of life she had planned, the kind of life she still wanted, teaching in a proper school, living in a city with bookshops and concert halls and pavement under her feet. She thought all of these things very clearly and arrived at the conclusion that she needed to be careful. She was not careful enough. Over the next 2 weeks, while the Winslow outfit prepared for the southward journey, Graham found reasons to come into the store nearly every other day. He was not inventing reasons. She could tell from the things he actually needed that he was genuinely preparing for a long drive. But he came in person rather than sending one of the other hands, which was its own kind of statement. They talked. They talked about books and about the trail, and about the particular quality of loneliness that came from living in a new place where you did not yet know anyone well enough to be yourself. He told her about growing up on the Winslow Ranch in South Texas, about his mother who had died when he was 12, about his father who was a hard man but a fair one, about the particular freedom of the open range that he had spent most of his life taking for granted, until he started to think about whether freedom was something you could choose to give up for the right reasons. She told him about St. Louis, about her father, who had been a kind and impractical man, better at books than at money. About her year's teaching, which she had genuinely loved. About the specific homesickness she felt, which was not so much for a place as for a version of herself that felt confident and settled and purposeful. "You're purposeful here," he said. "I feel like a guest," she said, "like someone borrowed something and has not yet decided whether to keep it." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about this in the honest way he thought about things. "What would make you feel like you belonged here?" he asked. "I don't know that I can," she said. "I don't know that I want to. This is not the life I planned." He looked at her steadily. "Plans change. Sometimes," she said, "but not always for the better." It was during this conversation that she said it plainly, because she thought it was important to be honest with him, given the way things were developing, and the way she could see him looking at her, and the way she felt when he walked into a room. She said it because she liked him and liked him enough to tell him the truth before either of them invested too much in something that could not work the way he might want it to. "Graham," she said carefully, "I want you to understand something. I am not interested in the frontier life. Not permanently. I came here because I had to, and I intend to go back to the city when I am able. I think you are a good man, and I enjoy talking with you more than I've enjoyed talking with most people in a long time, but I would not want you to think I am someone who is going to stay and build a life out here, because I don't believe that's true." He listened to all of this. He was very still while she said it, not uncomfortable, just attentive, in the way he was attentive to everything. Then he said, simply and without drama, "Stay and see." She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Stay and see," he said again, with the slight almost smile that she had come to recognize as his version of warmth. "You've been here 5 months. You've survived the worst of the summer heat and the dust and the stockyard smell, and you're teaching children who are better for it, and you're running your brother's store better than he was running it himself. You don't know yet what this place is to you. Stay and see what it turns into." She opened her mouth to argue, and he held up one hand, not in a dismissing way, just a gentle pause. "I'm not asking you to change your plan tonight," he said. "I'm asking you to not close the door yet. That's all." She did not have a response to that felt entirely adequate, so she said, "The drive south leaves in 4 days." "It does," he said. "I'll be back in spring. That's 6 months." "It is," he said. He picked up his hat from the counter. "Will you be here?" She thought about Thomas, who needed her. She thought about the children in the schoolhouse who were making progress she found genuinely meaningful. She thought about the North Ridge at sunset. "I'll be here," she said. "For the winter at least." He put his hat on and smiled, the full version of it this time, which transformed his face in a way that was not fair, she thought, because it was very difficult to be unmoved by. "Then I'll come back to the North Ridge in spring," he said. "Good evening, Miss Ramsey." He left. She stood behind the counter for a long moment, and then Thomas came out from the back room where he had definitely been listening, and he said, with the carefully neutral expression that meant he had very strong opinions but was choosing to be diplomatic, "Graham Winslow is a good man." "I know," she said. "His family's ranch is solid. They're not rich, but they're not struggling either. His father's getting older, and they're looking at settling the operation, not always trailing cattle up to Kansas every year." "Thomas," she said, "I'm just saying. I know what you're saying." "Then I'll stop saying it," he said, and went back to the stockroom. The winter in Caldwell was hard in a way that was different from St. Louis hard. It was windswept and stark and isolating in a way that a city, with its close buildings and its crowds and its constant noise, never quite allowed a person to feel. The prairie in winter was vast and silent and occasionally magnificent, with storms that covered everything in white and mornings that emerged from those storms with a clarity that was almost painful to look at. Julia taught her classes through the cold months, walking to the schoolhouse every afternoon in a heavy coat she had bought at the store. She kept the books for Thomas, expanded the inventory in small ways that improved the store's income, and spent her evenings reading and writing letters and thinking about things she was not entirely ready to examine directly. She wrote to Graham once, because it seemed like a reasonable thing to do, a brief letter describing the winter school and an interesting argument she had gotten into with Mayor Aldridge about the library fund she was trying to establish. She addressed it to the Winslow Ranch in Laredo and gave him no reason to read anything into it. It was simply a letter between people who had talked enough that silence felt unnecessary. He wrote back in January, a letter that arrived on a bitter cold day when the wind had been blowing for 3 days straight, and she had been inside with a head cold and a copy of Thomas Hardy and a particular low mood. His letter was 2 pages, written in a clear and direct hand, and it described the ranch in winter and a specific argument he had gotten into with his father about buying a new bull, and a story about one of the ranch hands that was genuinely funny in a dry, understated way, and at the very end, a single sentence that said, "I think about the North Ridge and the company I had there more often than is probably practical. I hope the winter is treating you well enough." She read that last sentence several times. Then she put the letter in the drawer of her writing desk where she kept her father's letters, which was the highest compliment she had to offer in terms of material objects. She wrote back in February. He wrote again in March. By the time April came and the air began to warm and the light changed and the cattle season approached, they had exchanged 6 letters each, and Julia had arrived at the uncomfortable and rather irritating realization that she was looking forward to seeing Graham Winslow in a way that had moved considerably beyond simply finding him interesting to talk to. She did not revise her position about the frontier life. She still believed everything she had said to him about it, but she had stopped being as certain as she once was that her position about the frontier life was the whole of the matter. Spring arrived with the grass greening and the sky opening up in that particular wide way it did after winter. And with it came the sound that Caldwell knew well by now, the distant low murmur of a herd coming north, growing over the course of a morning into something you could feel in the ground under your feet. Julia was at the school when the drive arrived, and she finished her lesson and dismissed the children and walked back to the store, where she found Thomas already busy with men restocking their supplies. She went behind the counter and began helping, and it was perhaps 20 minutes before the door opened again and Graham Winslow came in. He had filled out slightly over the winter, which the months of ranch work rather than trail work sometimes did to a man. He looked rested in a way he had not quite looked at the end of the last trail. His hat was the same one from fall, she noticed, the newer one. He saw her from across the store and his whole face changed in a way that was very simple and entirely unguarded, a quick, genuine brightness that he did not try to moderate or conceal. She felt her own face doing something similar and was briefly annoyed by this because she had composed herself and everything. "Miss Ramsey," he said, coming to the counter. "Mr. Winslow," she said, "your account is in good order. The winter was quiet on the books." "Good," he said. He was not looking at the books. "You look well. You look less dusty than usual," she said. "Give it a day." He laughed, a real laugh, easy and warm, true enough. He settled his arms on the counter. "Did the library fund come together?" She was surprised and pleased that he had remembered, partially. "Mayor Aldridge contributed and I organized a subscription drive among the families with children in school. We have 43 books now, which is 43 more than we had." "That's substantial," he said seriously. He meant it. "The children are the best readers," she said. "Better than their parents in most cases, which suggests the investment is worthwhile." They talked for longer than the transaction required. Thomas, behind her somewhere, did not make any pointed noises about the amount of time she was spending not working, which was its own kind of permission. That evening, Graham asked if she would walk with him again, and she went, because she wanted to, and because she had decided during the winter that she would not lie to herself about what she wanted even when what she wanted was complicated. They walked back to the North Ridge as though the winter had been only a pause in a conversation, and the sky performed its evening colors as promised, and they stood in comfortable silence for a while looking at it. "I got your letters," he said. "I received yours." "I liked writing them," he said, "more than I expected." "You're better at it than you might think," she said. "The letter about the bull argument was very well constructed." He glanced at her sideways and she kept her expression straight, and then they both smiled at the same time, which felt like something. "Julia," he said, which was the first time he had used her first name, and it did something very specific to the quality of the air between them. "I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing." She looked at the horizon for a moment. The colors were moving through their changes. A hawk crossed the lower part of the sky and was gone. "I told you last fall," she said carefully, "that I'm not certain this is the life I want. I haven't changed that position." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to change it. I'm asking you to let me spend time with you while you figure it out." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that particular attention of his, steady and patient, and without any of the manipulation she might have expected from a man who wanted something from a woman. He was simply there, being honest, which was, she thought, really the most dangerous thing a person could be. "All right," she said. "Properly mind." "Properly," he agreed. And in that moment she could hear the slight thickening of his voice that meant he was more affected by this than he was showing, which she found she was very glad of. The courtship that followed was exactly what he had promised, proper and patient, and conducted with a kind of care that she found both touching and occasionally frustrating, because she discovered that she wanted to move faster than he was moving, which was an interesting reversal of what she had expected. He called on her at the store every other day, always with Thomas present or nearby, which was the appropriate form. He took her to church on Sunday mornings, where the congregation noticed and said nothing to them but plenty to each other, which Julia was accustomed to and did not mind. He bought her nothing extravagant because that was not his nature, but he brought her small things. A wildflower he had pressed flat between a piece of board because he thought she might want to send it to her friend in St. Louis. A copy of a novel he had found at the Trading Post in Wichita because he thought she had mentioned wanting to read it. A jar of honey from a ranch family south of town because she had mentioned once that she liked honey in her tea. She saved all of these things. She also paid attention to him in a way that she realized, over the weeks of his visit, was teaching her something about the kind of man he was that no amount of conversation quite conveyed. She watched how he treated the men who worked for him, with the kind of respect that expected respect back, without condescension or cruelty. She watched how he handled a horse, which was with a patience and a steadiness that spoke of a person who understood the value of a quiet approach. She watched him in the store, helping an older rancher who came in one afternoon struggling with the weight of a supply order, and he helped without being asked and without making anything of it. She watched him with her students, because one afternoon in May, she was caught at the school later than expected by a broken window latch that needed fixing, and Graham showed up to walk her home and ended up spending 40 minutes answering questions from a 12-year-old named Samuel about the mechanics of a cattle drive. And he was patient and detailed and spoke to Samuel, as though Samuel's questions were worthy of serious answers, which they were. She walked home beside him that afternoon and said, "You'd be a good teacher." "Different kind," he said. "You teach them to think, I just tell them what I know." "That's teaching," she said. He thought about this. "I suppose it is." There was a social gathering at the town hall in June, a summer celebration that Caldwell organized around the high point of the cattle season, and Graham asked if he could escort her, which Thomas greenlighted with a speed that was almost embarrassing. She wore her best dress, which was blue with white trim, and she did her hair more carefully than usual. And when Graham came to the door in a clean shirt and a jacket she had not seen on him before, they looked at each other for a moment with the expression of two people who are very aware of what the other is seeing. The dance hall was warm and loud with fiddle music, and the happy collision of 100 people glad to see each other after months of hard work. Graham danced, which she had not known about him and which delighted her. He was not polished, but he was confident and rhythmically correct, and she was a better dancer than he expected, which she could tell from the way his face opened up the first time they moved well together. They danced 4 sets together and one with other partners, because propriety required it, and both of them spent those separate dances with something of the focused look of people waiting to get back to the conversation they were actually interested in. He walked her home under a sky full of stars, and at the door of the store he held her hand for a moment, just the hand, and looked at her in the way he had that she now recognized as him saying something without words that he was not yet ready to say with them. She went upstairs and sat at the window and thought about St. Louis for the first time in weeks, and realized that she was comparing it to this, and that the comparison was becoming less one-sided than she had expected. She wrote to Margaret, "I am in considerable trouble, and I want you to know I am aware of it, and I have decided to simply let it happen and see what becomes of it. This will either be the best or the worst decision I have ever made, and I find that I cannot quite make myself care which." Margaret wrote back, "Julia Ramsey, you are in love. Accept it gracefully." Julia folded the letter and put it in the drawer with Graham's letters and did not argue with it. In July, the summer heat descended on Caldwell with a thoroughness that impressed even Julia, who thought she had experienced heat in St. Louis. This was different, dry and relentless, radiating up from the earth as much as down from the sky, and the air over the prairie shimmered in the afternoons in a way that made everything at a distance seem to move. She and Graham found a new habit for the evenings during the heat, sitting on the bench outside the store in the cooler air after supper, talking until the light was gone. Thomas would come out for part of the evening and then, with a propriety that was slightly theatrical, announce that he was very tired and going to bed, which left them alone in the way that satisfied both form and intention. These were the evenings she loved best. The town quieted down as the hour grew late, and the stars came out in numbers that still astounded her after more than a year of seeing them. And they talked without any pressure, about everything and nothing, about what he wanted the ranch to become, and what she had loved best about teaching, and about whether the town of Caldwell had a real future or would empty out when the cattle trade moved on, as everyone knew it eventually would. She asked him once, on one of those July evenings, what he would do if the cattle trail ended. It was a real question. The railroad was pushing west, and everyone in the cattle business knew that eventually the long drives north would stop being necessary. He was quiet for a moment, which was how he was when he was thinking seriously about something. "The ranch," he said at last. "We've got good land down south. The goal is always to build enough that we don't have to trail cattle north forever. My father wants to breed better stock, not just drive range cattle. There's a future in that, I think." "You'd be staying in Texas," she said. "South Texas," he said. "On the ranch." He looked at her steadily. "I have been thinking about that and whether it matters to what's between us." She held his gaze. "It matters to me being honest with you," she said. "I told you before that I'm not certain about this life." "You said you were not interested in the frontier life," he said. "South Texas is not Kansas. The ranch is different from a cattle town. There are towns nearby, proper ones with schools and churches and people who read books." He paused. "I'm not trying to argue you into something. I just want you to know what the picture actually looks like." She thought about this for several days afterward. She thought about what she had meant when she said frontier life, and whether she had meant the specific hardships she had encountered or something more fundamental about the kind of existence she wanted. She thought about the children in her schoolhouse and what it would mean to leave them. She thought about Thomas, who had come to depend on her in ways he would not easily admit. She thought about north ridges and sunsets and letters and peppermints, and a man who looked at her with complete attention and said, "Stay and see." In late July, something happened that she had not anticipated, and that changed the texture of everything. A fire broke out in the livery stable on a hot, dry Thursday evening, and it went fast the way fires do in dry weather. And before the bucket brigade had done much more than contain it to the livery itself, a burning board fell and caught the side of the building next door, which was an empty property, but which shared a wall with the eastern side of Ramsey's general store. Thomas got there first and pulled out the most important stock and the ledger books. Julia came down from upstairs and did the same, carrying armfuls of inventory out through the back while the smoke thickened. Graham was there within minutes, appearing out of the crowd that had gathered, and he went straight to the back of the store without being asked and helped Thomas carry out everything they could reach while the fire climbed the shared wall. They saved most of the stock. The eastern wall of the store was badly damaged, but the rest of the building held, and the fire was eventually controlled. In the aftermath, Julia stood in the street with soot on her dress and her hair falling out of its pins and looked at the damage, and felt something settle in her chest that was not despair. She felt, rather to her own surprise, that she knew exactly what to do. She assessed the damage practically, made a list in her head, calculated what could be repaired and how quickly, and began organizing the recovery almost before the smoke had cleared. She directed 2 of the men who had helped with the bucket brigade to help Thomas board up the damaged wall, sent a boy for the town carpenter, and started sorting the rescued stock into categories by condition. Graham appeared beside her at some point during all of this and said, "You know what you're doing." "Of course I do," she said without looking up from the stock sorting. "Someone has to." He was quiet for a moment. "You belong here," he said. She looked up at that. He was not saying it as an argument or a manipulation. He was saying it as a simple observation, the way he said most things, as a fact he had noticed and was reporting. She thought about arguing. Then she thought about the last 16 months and the library books and the children who were reading better than they had before, and the accounts she had organized, and the specific competence she felt right now in the middle of a crisis, knowing what to do and doing it. "Perhaps I'm more suited to it than I thought," she said carefully. The store was repaired within 3 weeks, the town carpenter working efficiently, and the community lending hands in the way frontier communities did, which she had observed before but now felt more personally. Neighbors brought food. Families with children in her school sent their older sons to help with the heavy work. The blacksmith repaired the iron fittings on the damaged shelving at no charge. She told Graham about all of this one evening, the way the community had moved in like a tide, and he listened and nodded and said, "That's what it is here. It's not easy and it's not always pretty, but when something happens, the people show up." "I know," she said. "I've been watching it for over a year, and it's only recently that I've understood it." He looked at her with a careful expression. "And what do you understand now that you didn't before?" She took a breath. "I understand that I came here thinking it was temporary, and I told myself that every day, and I used it to keep myself from being affected by anything. But I have been affected. I'm different here than I was in St. Louis, and not in a way that feels like loss. In a way that feels like something was added." He said nothing, waiting. "I'm not going to pretend I've stopped wishing for bookshops," she said, "or that the stockyard smell has grown on me, because it has not. But I think I understand now that those things are not the whole question." She looked at him directly. "You are not a small part of that understanding." The words hung between them in the evening air, the warm July dark settling around the bench, the sounds of the town fading. Graham set down the cup of coffee he was holding and turned to face her fully. "Julia," he said, and his voice was not quite steady, which she found she was very glad of. "I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd time I came into your store for no reason I could have justified to anyone who asked." The directness of this, stated so simply and without ornamentation, did something to her composure that she had not quite prepared for. She felt it in her chest, a spreading warmth, and her eyes went briefly bright, and she did not look away. "You were buying peppermints," she said, "and asking about books." "I was," he said, "and neither of those things required as many separate visits as I made." She laughed softly, and it was the laugh of a woman who had been trying to be sensible about something that was not sensible and had finally been given permission to stop. "I have been," she said carefully, "very much in love with you too, for some time. I was simply not ready to let myself admit it because I had made up my mind about my life before you came into it, and complicating that felt irresponsible." He reached across and took her hand, slowly and deliberately, the way he did everything. His hands were rough from years of rope and leather, and hers were rough now too from the work of the store and the fire and everything that had come between April 1882 and this evening, and they fit together in the particular way of two people who have found the thing they were looking for. "I love you," he said again, simply, "and I would very much like to ask you to marry me, if you're willing to think about it." She looked at him for a long moment, at the familiar lines of his face, at the gray-green eyes that had caught the light of her store window on that first afternoon, at the steadiness of him that she had come to trust more completely than she had trusted anything or anyone in a very long time. "Ask me properly," she said, "and I'll answer properly." He got off the bench, which made her blink, and went down on one knee in the dust of the Caldwell street, and said, with the seriousness and the simplicity that were the most essentially himself things about him, "Julia Ramsey, I love you, and I would be honored if you would agree to be my wife. I can't promise you a city, but I can promise you a home that's solid and a man who will spend his life paying attention to you, and a piece of land in South Texas that has a ridge like this one, where the sky does that same thing every evening." There was a moment of the particular quality of silence that contained something enormous. "Yes," she said. "Graham, yes." He stood and she stood too, and he kissed her for the first time, a kiss that was careful and warm and completely sure of itself, in the middle of the street in the warm July dark, and it was the most honest thing she had ever done. Thomas, watching from the window, made no effort to conceal the fact that he was wiping his eyes. They were married in September 1883, in the white-painted church at the end of Caldwell's Main Street, on a clear morning with that particular wide autumn sky above them. Julia wore a dress she had made herself with help from the wife of the town carpenter, a practical and lovely woman named Elena, who had become something close to a friend over the months. Thomas walked her down the aisle and sat in the front row with an expression of pure, ungoverned happiness. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister, a dry and decent man who had been in Caldwell long enough to know most of its business, and conducted the service with appropriate gravity and one well-chosen sentence about the specific courage it took to build something new. Graham stood at the altar in a good jacket and clean trousers, and looked at her with the expression she had come to love most, the one that was simply him looking at her, fully and without reserve. She said yes with her whole self, which was a different thing from saying yes with calculation or hope or even love alone. She said it with the certainty of someone who had examined a choice from every angle and arrived at it honestly. They had a modest celebration in the town hall, with fiddle music and food brought by half the congregation, and they danced together the way they had danced at the summer social, only better now, because there was nothing held back. They left Caldwell 2 weeks later for the Winslow Ranch in South Texas, which meant another train journey, this one heading south and west, through country that changed gradually from the flat Kansas plains to the brushy, wider landscape of Texas. Julia watched it out the window and took note of the differences. The Winslow Ranch was called the Bar W, and it occupied several hundred acres of good grass country about 15 miles from a town called Cowboy, which was a proper town with a post office and a school and a general store and a doctor. She noted these things immediately and was grateful for them. Amos Winslow, Graham's father, was a weathered, direct man of 60 who shook her hand rather than nodding to her, which she took as a sign of genuine respect. He was not a warm man in the easy sense, but he was honest and fair, and she could see Graham in him in the structural way, the steadiness, the economy of words, the quality of attention. He had hired a housekeeper, a capable Mexican woman named Senora Delgado, who looked Julia over with sharp, kind eyes and said, in accented but precise English, "You look like someone who knows how to work. Good. There is plenty of that here." Julia said, "I was a teacher and I ran a general store for 18 months. Senora Delgado nodded once and said, "Good," again, and that was the beginning of a friendship that would last many years. The ranch house was not large, but it was solid, with thick walls that kept it cool in summer and warm in winter, and Graham had spent the summer adding a room that was clearly intended to serve as a study, with bookshelves along one wall. She stood in that room the first evening and ran her hand along the empty shelves and felt something that was completely without ambivalence, something that was simply belonging. "You built this for me," she said. "I built it for us," he said, "but I had you in mind." She filled the shelves slowly over the following months, ordering books from a bookseller in San Antonio, supplementing them with volumes Thomas sent down from Caldwell. She also wrote to the school board in Cowboy about the possibility of teaching, and was hired for the afternoon session by November, which solved the particular restlessness she always felt when she was not teaching. The town of Cowboy, she discovered, was in the process of becoming real rather than simply existing. There were families building permanent homes, a women's reading circle that met on Tuesday evenings, a plan for a proper library that she immediately offered to help organize. It was not St. Louis, but it was not the raw, provisional settlement she had first imagined frontier life to be. It had the quality of a place becoming itself. She wrote to Margaret, "I believe I may have been wrong about some things, not all things, but some important ones." Margaret came to visit the following spring and spent 2 weeks at the ranch, and left saying, "You are disgustingly happy, and this place is far better than I expected, and I reserve the right to say I told you so even though I only told you so after the fact." Life on the Bar W had its rhythms. The ranch work was demanding, and Graham was away from the house during the daylight hours, which she had expected, and which she used for teaching and reading, and the small administrative work she had taken on for the Caldwell school. Evenings were theirs, the way the bench outside Ramsey's store had been theirs, easy and warm and full of conversation that felt necessary rather than social. She learned to ride properly that first winter, because the ranch required it, and because she refused to be someone who lived on a piece of land without being able to move across it freely. Graham taught her, with the same patience he brought to everything, and she was a better student than either of them expected, taking to it with a natural rhythm that surprised her. Within 3 months, she could move across the ranch at a pace that felt like flight, the horse beneath her and the wide Texas sky above, and the land running away in all directions with a beauty that was different from Kansas but equally real. She had her particular ridge here too. A slight rise to the east of the ranch house where the sunset performed its daily miracle, and she took to riding up there in the early evening, sometimes alone and sometimes with Graham beside her, and she thought often about the first time he had taken her to the North Ridge in Caldwell and the way the sky had stopped her breath. She thought about how he had said, "Stay and see." She had stayed. She had seen. In the early months of 1884, she told Graham she was expecting their first child. She told him in the study, because that was the room that felt most like the center of the life they had built together. He sat very still for a moment, and then he crossed the room and held her in the careful and complete way he had of holding things he was afraid of damaging, and he said nothing for a long time, which was its own very eloquent statement. Amos Winslow received the news with a quiet satisfaction that was as close to joy as he usually got, and Senora Delgado was simply and practically delighted, and immediately began organizing the house for a baby, with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this particular project. The child was born in October 1884, a boy, loud and healthy and very opinionated about the world from his first moment in it. They named him Harold James Winslow, Harold for Julia's father and James for Graham's grandfather, and from the first day he was in the world, he had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's quality of paying intense, focused attention to everything around him. Graham held his son with the same gentleness he brought to everything that mattered to him, sitting in the chair by the window of their room on the evening of the birth, and Julia watched him from the bed, tired to her bones and happier than she had words for, and thought that life had a way of showing you things you could not have imagined asking for. Amos Winslow, who had never been an easy man to read, came into the room that evening and looked at his grandson for a long time without saying anything, and then he put his hand briefly on Graham's shoulder, which was, from Amos, the equivalent of a speech. Harold grew into a curious, energetic child who followed his father around the ranch with the intensity of someone taking notes, asking questions in a rapid and often unanswerable sequence that Graham answered with patient detail. He also followed his mother to school whenever he was old enough to sit still for it, which was earlier than most children, because he had inherited her appetite for the inside of a book. Thomas came south to visit when Harold was 18 months old and spent a week on the ranch, and spent most of that week trying to appear casual about how much he loved seeing his sister like this, settled and rooted and fully herself. He had brought the general store through its challenges and had recently taken on a partner, a practical man named Forbes who had capital and steady habits, and the store was doing well. "I might come south more often," Thomas said on his last evening, watching Harold toddle determinedly across the yard after a chicken. "If you'd have me." "We'd have you," Julia said. "We'd be glad of it." He left the next morning, and she stood on the porch watching his wagon down the road, and she thought about the train platform at Caldwell, and the wind taking her hat, and the certainty she had felt in that moment that she was in the wrong place. She had been wrong about that. It had taken a year and a half and one very patient cowboy and a fire and a ridge full of sunset colors to teach her that, but she had learned it. Life on the Bar W continued to open out in the years that followed. The ranch grew, not dramatically, because the Winslows were not dramatic people, but steadily and with the kind of intentionality that Amos had always practiced and Graham was refining. They moved into better breeding stock, as Graham had described that summer evening in Caldwell, and the quality of the cattle on the Bar W improved in a way that brought better prices at the market and made the business more resilient. Amos, who had been slowing for 2 years, died in the spring of 1887, peacefully in his sleep, which was the kind of death a hard-working man deserved. Graham was 40 years old, no, he was 32 by then, and he absorbed the loss with the particular grief of a son who had not always had easy communication with his father, but had understood him and been understood by him in the ways that mattered. Julia sat with him on their ridge the evening after the funeral and held his hand and did not try to fill the silence, because she had learned from him that silence was sometimes the most respectful container for something large. "He liked you," Graham said at last. "He was not a man who made it easy to tell, but he did. He told me once in his way that you were the right kind of woman for this life." "What was his way?" she asked. "He said, 'She's got more bottom than I gave her credit for.'" "That's a compliment from him," she laughed softly. "I'll take it. I know you will." They sat until the stars were fully out, and then they went back to the house where Harold, 4 years old now, and at that age of absolute confidence about the importance of his own observations, was being minded by Senora Delgado and had been asking questions about the stars for the better part of an hour. Harold proved to be the first of 3 children. In 1887, a few months after Amos's death, Julia realized she was expecting again, and this time the child born in February 1888 was a girl, whom they named Clara after Graham's mother. Clara was quieter than Harold from the beginning, a child who observed before she acted, with her mother's dark hair and a stillness that reminded Julia of Graham in the way he had of paying complete attention. The third child came in 1890, another boy, named Thomas after his uncle, who drove south from Caldwell for the birth and spent 3 weeks at the ranch afterward, during which he bonded so thoroughly with his namesake that Graham began to suspect that Thomas would eventually follow his sister south. He did, in fact, 3 years later. He sold his share of the Caldwell store to his partner Forbes and came to Cotala, where he bought a modest property and eventually opened a hardware business that did well. Having her brother within an hour's ride was something Julia had not let herself wish for too intensely, because the distance had seemed fixed, and discovering that it was not fixed was one of the quiet delights of those years. She continued to teach. The school in Cotala grew with the town, and by 1889 they had a proper 2-room schoolhouse and 2 teachers, and Julia was the senior of the 2, which came with a modest additional responsibility and a satisfaction she found completely genuine. She had not expected to love teaching in Texas any more or less than she had loved teaching in Kansas, but she found that the specific combination of the children she knew, the town she had become part of, and the life she went home to in the evenings made it feel like something she had been moving toward all along. The library she had helped organize became real in 1888, when the town approved a small building for it, and a family named Cortez donated 100 volumes from their personal collection. Julia was elected to the library board, which she considered one of the more satisfying things her name had ever been attached to. She and Graham fell into the settled rhythms of a life built together, which were different from the charged, uncertain rhythms of courtship, but not less beautiful. They had their disagreements, because they were both people with convictions and the habit of expressing them, and these were real disagreements, argued through with the directness that was characteristic of them both and resolved with the same. They came out the other side of every argument, she found, knowing each other slightly better than before, which seemed to her the right use of conflict. She loved him in the deep and daily way of someone who has learned a person completely and chosen them anyway, which was the truest kind of love she knew. She loved the way he moved through the world with that particular steadiness, the way he was with the children, patient and interested and willing to be surprised by them. She loved the way he still, after years of her living there and the land being as familiar to her as her own reflection, brought her to the ridge on evenings when the light was doing something especially worth seeing, because he wanted to share it, and he still noticed when she loved something. She loved that he still kept peppermints in his shirt pocket. In the fall of 1891, Graham's closest friend from the trail, a man named Chet Morrison, came through on his way from San Antonio to the north and stayed at the ranch for a week. Chet was a straightforward, cheerful man who had known Graham for 15 years, and he sat on the porch on his second evening and looked out at the ranch and the house and the 3 children visible through the window at the supper table and said to Graham, "You did right." "I know," Graham said. "She's remarkable," Chet said. "I mean no disrespect." "None taken," Graham said. "I know what she is." Julia, coming onto the porch with coffee, caught the end of this exchange and chose not to remark on it, only handed Chet his cup and sat beside Graham and felt the specific warmth of being known and valued by the person you had chosen, which was a warmth that did not diminish with time. The years of the late 1880s and into the 1890s brought changes to the region that Julia had anticipated intellectually but still found striking in practice. The railroad reached Caldwell, which changed everything. The pace of commerce, the ease of travel, the availability of goods that had previously required long waits for freighting. She could now order books from San Antonio and receive them in a matter of days. She could correspond with Margaret in St. Louis and expect answers within a week. The world was getting smaller in ways that were sometimes wonderful and occasionally mourned, because some things about the distance and the silence and the particular feeling of a wide open country had been beautiful precisely because of their difficulty. She wrote an essay about this for the Caldwell paper, at the editor's request. It was the first piece of writing she had published, and she found she had more to say than she expected about what the frontier had been and what it was becoming and what was gained and lost in the transition. People in town talked about it, which was strange and satisfying in equal measure. Graham read it twice. He said, "You should write more." "I have a library and a school and 3 children," she said. "There's a desk in the study," he said. "It's yours." She began writing in the early mornings, before the house fully woke, in the study with its bookshelves now full, and its window looking east toward the ridge. She wrote about the frontier and about education, and about the specific experience of being a woman who had come west against her wishes and found herself staying by choice. It was not yet anything in particular, not a book or a series of articles, but it was something, a way of making sense of her own life by putting it into language. She thought doing this about the injustices she had witnessed during her years in the West. The land taken from the Comanche and other peoples who had lived on it for generations, documented in the flat and matter-of-fact accounts of older settlers who spoke of it without particular shame, as though it were simply weather. She had watched the last of those dispossessions play out in the years of her early time in Texas, and she had no language adequate to the scale of it, but she did not want to look away from it either. She included it in what she wrote, because she believed that the story of the West was not honest if it only included the settlers and their triumphs, and did not reckon with what those triumphs had cost. It was not comfortable writing, and it was not entirely comfortable to publish. But she had not been raised to be comfortable at the expense of honest, and she continued. Harold turned 10 in 1894, a boy of serious intellectual ambitions and considerable energy, who was the delight of his father's working days and the occasional challenge of his mother's patience, because he asked questions in the night and followed arguments to their logical conclusion with a tenacity that was entirely familiar and entirely wearying in a child. Clara was 6, precise and observant and already an accomplished reader. Young Thomas was 4 and had Thomas Ramsey's social confidence and Graham Winslow's physical ease with the world, which produced a child who was good at everything and modest about none of it. Graham watched his children with the expression he had when something was exceeding his expectations, which was a very private pleasure of Julia's, to have given him things he had not known how to want until they arrived. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, September 1893, Graham took her to the ridge the way he had taken her to the North Ridge that first evening in Caldwell, and the sky performed its changes around them, the stars coming out one by one in the wide Texas dark. They sat together the way they had learned to sit, easy and close, her shoulder against his, 10 years of the particular weight of shared living between them. "I have something to tell you," he said. "Tell me," she said. "My father used to say that the best thing a man could do was find work that needed doing and do it well, and find a woman who was worth her salt and love her completely. He wasn't a sentimental man, but he meant that." "He was right on both counts," she said. "I've done both," Graham said. "I want you to know I know that, every day." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky, which was doing something exceptional above them, the color changes dramatic and slow, the horizon still holding a line of deep red while the zenith went dark and star-scattered. "You told me to stay and see," she said. "I did. I've seen," she said. "It turns out you were right." He laughed quietly, the easy laugh she still loved. "I wasn't certain I was right. I just thought the odds were good." "You had data," she said. "You had observed me for several months and arrived at a considered hypothesis." "I had," he said. "You taught school and ran a store and told me the exact truth about what you thought of this place without any softening. That told me you were someone who could handle what it actually was." She turned to look at him. This man she had chosen and kept choosing, every year, every season, every evening on every ridge. He was 40 now, his face lined by weather and time in a way she found completely without regret, and he looked back at her with the expression she had first seen in a store in Caldwell when he had no reason yet to look at her like that, only an instinct that turned out to be correct. "I love you," she said, "completely and without any reservations I haven't told you about." "I love you," he said. "Same." They sat until the dark was full and the stars were everywhere, and then they rode back to the ranch house together, side by side over the night-cool grass, and went inside to the warmth and light where their children were being impatiently waited for, Harold having apparently organized his siblings into a presentation of some kind that required both parents present. Harold's presentation turned out to be a detailed case for why the family should acquire a dog, delivered with the full rhetorical force of a 10-year-old who had been paying attention in school. He had enumerated the practical benefits of a ranch dog, addressed what he anticipated would be his mother's objections regarding household management, and included a cost-benefit analysis that made Graham's expression go carefully neutral in the way it did when he was suppressing something. Julia listened to the whole thing with her hands folded and her face composed. Then she said, "That was very well argued." "Thank you," Harold said, with immense dignity. "Your objection anticipation was incomplete," she said. "You did not address the issue of who will be primarily responsible for the animal." Harold had anticipated this. "I will be," he said, "with Clara's assistance." Clara from across the table nodded once with the gravity of a business partner agreeing to terms. "Then yes," Julia said, "we may acquire a dog." The celebration was immediate and considerable, and Graham beside her said quietly, "You were never going to say no." "I know," she said equally quietly. "But the argument was good and it deserved a fair hearing." They found the dog the following week, a young cattle dog, mostly blue heeler, from a neighboring ranch that had too many from a recent litter. Harold named him Aristotle, which made Julia's teacher's heart warm considerably. Aristotle grew up on the Bar W over the next few years as an integral part of its operation, working the cattle with an intelligence and a commitment to duty that Graham said was frankly embarrassing to some of the ranch hands. The years of the 1890s moved through them like seasons, each one different, and each one adding something to the account. Julia's writing grew into a real habit, and by 1895 she had enough pieces that the editor of the San Antonio paper asked if she would consider contributing regularly, which she did. a monthly column about education and the changing frontier and the specific perspective of a woman who had come west unwillingly and stayed willingly. It was read, she was told, by people across South Texas, which she found alternately thrilling and alarming. She sent copies of the columns to Margaret in St. Louis, who had now married a perfectly sensible man and had 2 children, and wrote back with the loyal enthusiasm of a friend who was proud of you even when she does not entirely understand why you have become a minor regional commentator on frontier education. Harold, at 15, had developed an interest in law that was clearly serious, the kind of interest that came from a particular quality of mind that needed adversarial structure to be happy. Graham supported this with the same practical attentiveness he brought to everything. Julia began looking into which schools might eventually accommodate him, because she was not going to be the kind of mother who let a serious mind stop at a local school when more was available. Clara, at 11, was quietly becoming a reader of exceptional range and depth, working through the study shelves with systematic efficiency, and occasionally cornering her father to discuss books he had not read and then summarizing them for him, which Graham submitted to with the patience of a man who genuinely found it interesting. Young Thomas was, at 9, the most physically capable of the 3, working beside his father on the ranch with a natural ease and an instinct for animal behavior that impressed even Senora Delgado, who was not easily impressed. He would be a rancher, Julia thought, and was glad of it because ranches needed people who loved them. Thomas Ramsey, Uncle Thomas, came for Christmas most years now, driving over from Caldwell, and he had become what Julia had hoped he might, a fixed point in the children's lives, the uncle who brought books and told stories about Caldwell that grew better with every retelling. He had married in 1892 a capable and cheerful woman named Ruth, and they had a daughter, and the family had extended itself in all the directions that families do when they have time and health and enough love between them. On the first day of January 1896, Julia sat at her desk in the study in the early morning quiet before anyone else was awake, and she wrote in her journal, which she had kept since coming to Texas, "I have been here 13 years. I came here saying I was not interested in this life, and a man told me to stay and see, and I stayed and I saw, and what I saw was that I had been wrong not about my values or my preferences or the things I loved, but about whether those things could live here. They can. I have taught hundreds of children and helped build a library and written things that people read and raised 3 remarkable people and loved a man who has been worth loving every day of the time I have known him. This is the life I would choose if I had to choose again. I would choose it faster." She closed the journal and put it in the drawer and sat for a moment in the quiet. The sun was coming up over the east ridge, the particular January light that was thin and clear and turned the grass a color between gold and silver. She watched it from the window until she heard Harold's boots on the stairs, his particular energetic tread that announced him before he arrived, and then Clara's quieter step, and then the unmistakable sound of young Thomas falling over Aristotle in the hallway, which happened approximately every 3rd morning and was always followed by a few seconds of startled silence and then laughter. Graham came into the study a few minutes later, having been up before her to check on the horses in the cold, with his jacket still on and his face ruddy from the January air. He stopped when he saw her at the window and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Good morning," he said at last. "Good morning," she said. He crossed the room, and she turned from the window, and he kissed her with the easy completeness of someone doing a thing they have done 10,000 times and still mean entirely. She could hear the children in the kitchen now, Harold explaining something at length to someone who had not asked, Clara setting the table with the methodical precision that she brought to everything, young Thomas reporting to Aristotle the situation regarding breakfast. "Do you know what I was thinking about just now?" she asked, against his jacket. "What?" "That first evening on the North Ridge in Caldwell," she said, "when you showed me the sunset." He pulled back enough to look at her face. Why? Because I was so determined to be unaffected by this place, she said, and I looked at that sky and I thought, well, that complicates things. It always does, he said. You planned that, she said. You knew what the sky looked like from that ridge and you took me there on purpose. I knew it was the most persuasive thing I had to show you, he said, without any guilt. I used it honestly, she laughed. You did. Did it work? Obviously, she said. I'm here. He smiled, the full version, the one that had been so difficult to be unmoved by 13 years ago and remained precisely as effective. You are here, he said, and I am very glad of it. So am I, she said. And she meant every syllable of it, with the full weight of everything she had learned about herself and this place and this man in the years since she had stepped off a train in a Kansas wind and thought she had made a terrible mistake. She had not made a mistake. She had arrived exactly where she was supposed to arrive, only she had not known it yet, and it had taken time and patience, and a man with gray-green eyes who believed in giving things the chance to show what they were before closing the door on them. She would spend the rest of her life being grateful for that. In the years that followed, Harold read law at a proper school in San Antonio and came home to set up a practice in Caldwell, where he became known for taking the cases that no one else wanted and for arguing them with a relentlessness that his mother recognized completely. Clara, at 18, went to a teaching college in San Antonio as her mother had done before her, and came back 2 years later to teach at the Caldwell school, sitting in a classroom that had Julia's fingerprints all over it and making it her own. Young Thomas stayed on the ranch and expanded it in partnership with his father, bringing to it the same instinct and energy that had been evident since he was 9 years old, and Aristotle, at a great age for a cattle dog, finally lay down in the warm kitchen and did not get up again, which was mourned by the whole family with the seriousness it deserved. Graham and Julia grew older in the way of people who have not made the mistake of thinking that growing older means stopping. They were on the ridge every clear evening, which had not changed. They argued about things and resolved them, which had not changed. He brought her books from San Antonio on his town trips, and she argued with him about ranch decisions, and both of them listened to the other carefully, which was the thing that had never changed, from the very first conversation across a store counter in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. She wrote. She taught until her knees would not allow the standing, and then she taught sitting, and then she advised the teachers who came after her. She had, by the time she was 50, the particular authority of someone who has done a thing long enough and well enough that the town simply assumes the thing belongs to them. Graham ran the Bar W with young Thomas and watched his children and grandchildren move across the land with the satisfaction of a man who built something and saw it continue. He had his ridge every evening, and he had Julia beside him, and these two facts together constituted everything he had ever wanted from his life, which made him, he thought, a very fortunate man. On their 20th anniversary, September 1903, he took her to the ridge in the evening which she had expected, and stood beside her while the sky did its thing, which she could now have described in technical detail but still found beautiful. I have never regretted staying and seeing, she said before he could speak, because after 20 years she could predict him and still she chose to say it. He took her hand. I knew you wouldn't, he said. You did not, she said. You hoped I wouldn't, that is different. You're right, he said. I hoped. It was a good hope, she said, one of the better ones. The sky went through its changes above them, amber to rose to deep violet, the stars coming through the darkening blue one by one in the way they always did, patient and certain. The grass moved in a light wind. Somewhere below them the ranch was settling into evening, the sounds of it familiar and permanent. She had come here unwilling, and she had been given the grace of being wrong in the best possible way, and she had spent 20 years discovering everything that this life contained that she had not expected, which was, she thought, the only way you could ever really know a thing, by being willing to see it rather than only seeing what you had decided it was. She had stayed. She had seen. and everything she had seen had been worth the seeing. The wind moved through the grass below them with the sound she now knew as well as her own voice, and the first star of the evening came clear above the horizon, and Graham Winslow stood beside her on the ridge as the night came on, holding her hand, and Julia Ramsey, who had once stepped off a train into a Kansas wind and thought she was in the wrong place, looked out at the wide and beautiful world she had made her home and felt, with the complete and lasting certainty of someone who has finally stopped arguing with herself, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.